Welcome to the EcoThink podcast, where you join us on a dive into climate change and social justice issues through a STEAM lens. Each episode, we will break down silos, build up amazement, and bring on action. We invite you to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions. If you'd like to join the Eco Geeks in supporting this podcast for just a couple of dollars a month, you can do that on Patreon at www.patreon.com/EcoThink. Now let's get on to the show. Welcome to EcoThink Podcast. My name is Maya Karlsfeld, and today we're joined by Anna Bond. Anna Bond is the creator of the Lighter Footprint app and co-founder of Ethos Studio, a creative agency that supports academic institutions, engineers, developers, and nonprofits in creating more livable cities. Together with partner Robin Oshiro, Ethos has grown to serve clients in Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, San Francisco, and San Diego. In 2016, Anna was a finalist in MIT's international contest, Shifting Behavior for a Changing Climate. Her proposal called for a different climate change communication strategy, one emphasizing the co-benefits of a sustainable lifestyle. Anna holds a bachelor in communication design from Emily Carr University, a UX design certificate from Red Academy, and a social entrepreneurship diploma from Groundswell Economic Alternatives. Welcome to the show, Anna. Well, it's so great to have you on the show. Thank you for being willing to be interviewed today.
Yeah, no problem. It's gonna be fun. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah. So I'm talking to you from Victoria, and you're based in Vancouver. That's correct?
Yeah, that's right.
As we get started with this interview, we would love to learn a little bit more about you. So could you tell us a bit more about who you are and what brought you to climate change work as a whole?
Yeah, great question. Well, I definitely had a love of nature very early on. My parents were big hikers and backpackers. They actually met on like a 5-day backpacking trip.
Wow.
I know. I'm like, what a place to meet the love of your life.
That's amazing.
On Vancouver Island. And so they were always kind of like bringing my brother and I camping and hiking. And yeah, I feel very lucky that I had that connection to nature.
That's amazing.
In terms of career, I started out in a totally unrelated field in graphic design, branding, and marketing. That was just sort of what I naturally was good at and gravitated towards. And so my love of nature was kind of just like a sideline thing or just like a personal thing for a long time. But about 5 years ago now, about 5 years ago now, I went backpacking in Asia, and I had kind of like a revelatory experience there.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, I was traveling through China and India and like Vietnam, and essentially got lost in parts and ended up in these factory towns that were just really not designed for tourists. I just ended up crossing through. Yeah. And I remember one in particular, it was just like always foggy in that city, and or so I thought. And basically like so much so that you can see 20 feet in front of you, and everyone's always wearing a mask. Realized essentially that it was pollution from the nearby industry. And it was a really densely populated city with lots of people. And the experience like really had a huge impression on me for a couple of reasons. Like I just really felt for the people that had to live there day in and day out.
And work there. It's their livelihoods too. Yeah.
Exactly. It just really struck me that environmentalism is not kind of its own thing, its own silo. Like it really has to do with human rights and people. So it's about like having clean air, clean water, and also it's about like the next generation inheriting like a livable planet. So that really kind of connected the dots for me in a way that I had not at all thought before.
Amazing.
And so that plus my love of nature, I would say were the two underlying reasons I got into environmental work: a love of nature and love of people. I would say that the thing that really drove it home for me and really made climate change and the ecological crisis so urgent and so pressing was I stumbled across this idea in a documentary called The Age of Consequences. That's it. So Yeah, have you seen it?
I've not seen it, but I have heard of the title. Is it good?
It's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very mind-blowing. Like
Okay.
it sort of adds a whole new dimension to environmentalism and the climate
Oh,
change crisis. Yeah,
interesting.
so essentially it's all about the United States perception of climate change as a threat multiplier.
Oh,
And yeah, so what that means is that they basically see climate change as exacerbating all these other problems around the world. So things like you can imagine, like, I don't know, climate change causing drought and disrupting food production. But particularly for the United States military, they saw those things as causing political instability and extremism. So they
mm,
directly made the connection from climate change to like threats against the US.
yeah, interesting.
And yeah, I thought that was so fascinating. And so essentially, what I walked away from that uh, with was that climate change makes all other problems worse. So
Yeah.
essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? I'm like, makes sense. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so basically, if you care about anything, like
Yeah.
people, human rights, like inequalities all over the
Yeah.
world, like if you tackle climate, if you tackle the environmental crisis,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, you're going to have a ripple effect on everything.
Yeah.
So that just made so much sense to me in the sense of like, okay, if I'm going to dedicate my spare time, my efforts, like focusing on one problem, this seems like the most efficient problem to tackle.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you described that it's a it really does affect everything. And you don't really think about it at first, right? Like it doesn't seem obvious, but even something as
Mm-hmm.
simple as, a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or, the shirt that you wear, right? Like all of it's
Mm-hmm.
related in some way to how, this world functions. I mean, that's essentially what
Yeah,
climate change is
absolutely.
affecting. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's so simple, but for me, it actually took kind of a long time to realize that all this stuff, like everything we have, is like a product of nature or like
Yeah.
taken from nature in
Yeah.
some way.
Yeah.
Like I don't know where I thought it came from. Like I don't know, it just looks so like sterile and man-made. You're
Yeah.
just like, oh, it's just created in lab and like there it is.
Oh,
But
yeah.
like, yeah, I remember, yeah, at some point making that connection of like, oh, every single like coffee mug or tea
Yeah.
or whatever is like taken from nature, and every time we like live or do things or eat, like we kind of use a little bit up.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, the rate in which we use things
Yeah.
becomes really important. Yeah.
Yeah. I also love, so you said so much amazing stuff in that introduction. I love everything that you said. And one thing in particular I wanted to kind of go back to was your experience when you were backpacking, because I
Mm-hmm.
think it's so interesting that something that we don't think of as West Coast Canadians
Yeah.
often is, our privilege and our ability to be able to be so connected to
Yeah.
nature and wilderness and
Mm-hmm.
clean water, clean air, and this beauty that surrounds us. And
Yeah.
often it is that realization that there are millions of people around the world that live their lives in very smoggy, very un unclean, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
environments. And often that is as a direct result of a consumption where they're like the factory is perhaps building something to be exported to a different country, perhaps even Canada.
Yeah, exactly. That
Yeah.
was another takeaway from that
Yeah.
experience. Actually, you nailed it. I was like, well, two things. I'm like, oh, in some way, I mean, I'm not sure what those factories were producing, but
Yeah.
uh,
But you can imagine.
you could
Yeah.
assume that they were producing goods for global
Hmm.
distribution. Like it's very possible. So that's one thing. I was like, oh, I could be contributing to this in some
Yeah.
way that I don't understand.
Hmm.
And yeah, and also just like that kind of underlined the interconnectedness of the
Of
problem and
course. Yeah.
how it was just like it's everybody's problem essentially. You can't
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
silo yeah, one country against the
You
next.
can't draw a national border around it. It's
Yeah, totally,
yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously pollution and like the warming climate. Don't care about political borders and stuff like that.
Of course. Yeah, for sure. So you said that you were first and foremost, you were a graphic designer. So how did your work as a graphic designer and with the app development, so the Lighter Footprint app that you are currently working on, how did this all get started now that we've kind of heard your story of becoming an environmentalist?
Well, essentially, after I came back from that backpacking trip, I started thinking about how to apply my skills as a graphic designer to this problem. Like, obviously, I thought that would be the best. I can't like come up with a carbon capture technology or like a more efficient fuel source or whatever, but or a more green fuel source. But I was like, okay, with my very particular skills, is there something I can do to kind of help? So that was one thing. I was kind of looking for a way to contribute. And the other thing was I was doing a ton of research on what it meant to live sustainably. Like I became very obsessed with that question. I was just like, what does a sustainable life look like? And I was really discouraged by what I was finding, or at least I couldn't really apply it. There were two things, like either it was super detail oriented and very kind of like just like hidden in scientific papers and journals in a way that I could not really access as someone who hadn't studied that stuff. Or it was infuriatingly like broad and simplistic in terms of, I don't know, I was looking at stuff from the UN and from WWF, and they want to kind of give advice that applies globally. So as a result, it's often very broad and very generic. So it's stuff like eat less meat. And I was just like, how much meat? Like, I'm already, I'm cutting down a little bit, but it's like, is that enough? Is that good? Are some types of meat like better than others? Like, I don't know.
Does it matter if it was imported or exported? Does it matter like where it was grown?
Is it like factory farming that's an issue, or is it just all meat generally? And I really wanted to measure and know and be really precise about it. I felt like if I didn't know how much of an impact I was making, then any actions I was doing were just kind of like, it's like, who knows if it actually
it's kind of like a placebo effect almost.
Totally.
Like, it makes you feel like you're doing something okay, but really who's to say? It could make things worse. You don't know.
Exactly. And it was also very discouraging because I just never know if what I was doing was enough. It's kind of like, is this enough? Is that enough? Like, I didn't know where the line was. Obviously, at some point, if you are reducing too much, you can't like live an active, healthy life in our society. So I was just like, is this sacrifice enough, or should I? Anyway, it was kind of, I needed a way to measure and sort of think about it differently. So that was one thing. Oh, and the other thing is that I had no idea what made the biggest difference. So as I would say, a self-described somewhat lazy person, I wanted to know like, what is actually the biggest bang for my buck, for my effort? Are there some things that are quick and easy, or that I can take on that actually have a big impact, or not? So I was thinking about
focus your energy, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to find a place where, I wanted to tackle certain behaviors that actually had a huge impact and made a big difference. So that was all going on in the background. And then a friend recommended that I see a talk by Dr. Jenny Moore, incredible woman.
She's great.
Yes, force of nature. My goodness. Yeah. And she, so she's I think her title is Director of Sustainability at UCIT. And she had developed a tool that basically calculates the footprint of cities. And she had done like a huge analysis on Vancouver in particular. So her talk was about like all the data that came from that. And even though it was about the whole city, I sort of started thinking if we could break that down and then kind of create something for an individual living in that city. So
that's awesome.
I approached her afterwards, and much to her credit, she's like the busiest woman on the planet. She was like, yes, I will take on yet another project and do this with you. So it was so awesome to have her support, and of course, it just wouldn't be a reality without her. The Lighter Footprint app is basically powered by her data. And so what that means is that it's not, a lot of calculators out there are global, so they use global data and averaged throughout the whole world, but this app actually uses like super local data. So if you're in Vancouver, it'll use
Vancouver specific data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what are the implications of that though? Because you mentioned that there's this frustration of using global average data because it's just so broad that it doesn't really tell you much, right? So if I were to go to the carbonfootprint.org, I think is a website that allows you to do this, where you can calculate your personal carbon footprint. That number that it spits out, I'm assuming is going to be different than what the Lighter Footprint app is hopefully going to be able to give me because it's more specific. Is that kind of what we're going for here?
Yeah, totally. So like global footprint calculators don't take into account often the like energy system, for example, that your city is on. And that makes like a big difference. There's a bunch of other things also that go into it. So for example, because in BC, we have BC Hydro, it's like a much greener source of energy and electricity than some places in Germany that burn coal, for example, for their electricity. So yeah, a result you'll get with a global calculator, like of course they can kind of say somebody who's not flying at all has a lower footprint than somebody who's flying a ton, but the number is probably going to be off. It's better than nothing, of course, but the advantage of a local footprint is that you can get really, really precise. And that's really important when it comes to the next step, which is, okay, how can I reduce it? The answers to that are going to be much more accurate than a global calculator.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the development of the app then, like in terms, so like what's involved in developing this kind of app? Like I use apps, I use a lot of apps, but like what are the steps that you needed to do to get to where you are now, and what are steps that might still need to happen?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting process. I love it. It's like the perfect blend of creativity and kind of science, where you are coming up with these creative solutions and then trying to measure if your tests are successful or not. So the Lighter Footprint app was built in the lean startup model, it's called. It's basically kind of a way of creating products that was developed in Silicon Valley. And it's most relevant to products that don't exist yet. So when it's like a totally new thing with not a very clear market, or you're not sure exactly what problem you're trying to answer or what solution is best. So the lean startup model basically has you create an MVP, a minimum viable product, as soon as possible. So you will kind of create a very rough prototype and then continually test it. There's a saying, I think it's by like the co-founder of LinkedIn, that goes, if you are not embarrassed by your prototype, then you've launched too late. So yeah, that is the name of the game, is putting it out there, testing it with real people that, you know, have kind of a desire to solve this problem that you're trying to address, and then using their feedback to help refine the product. So that's what we've been doing. It started out very simple, wireframing, which basically means like sketching out the app screens just with like boxes, and it's very ugly. It looks nothing like the finished product. It's like button goes here, copy goes there, and then showing it to people. And then, kind of developing user flows, basically thinking, okay, like if this person wants to solve this problem, how do they move through the app to do so?
Like what buttons do they click? Where do they scroll to? Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, but also kind of like what pages do they go to solve their problem? So say if you determine that the thing that people most want to do is track their footprint, then you want to make the pathway for them to do that like as simple as easy as possible. Say that was like the primary use of the app, then you would, basically design it around that to accommodate these different ways people are using it. Yeah, you start out with really basic. We have all these prototyping tools where like XD and Sketch, where you build an app that doesn't actually work yet, but then people can still click on it, and you get like a lot of feedback from people that way. And you do create a working prototype that is just super rough. You can't wait too long with trying to like fix all the bugs and stuff like that before you show it to people. Essentially, if you were to perfect a product before showing it to people, it's very likely that you will build the wrong thing.
For sure. Yeah. I was just going to say that I would say that this is a lesson that applies to pretty much any creative project, really. Like if you have something that's meant to solve a problem, at the very least. I guess if it's an art piece or a book or something, it might not be exactly like this. But if it's you imagine that there's a problem, but nobody else is imagining the same thing, then you might end up having to go back to the drawing board. Yeah,
I think it's a really it's a method that can apply to lots of areas of life, like you were saying. Like, for example, I think there's a lot of value in acting early and sort of aiming or refining your approach later on. I think there's an expression that goes, instead of ready, aim, fire, it should be like fire, get ready, and then aim again, or something along those lines.
Oh, I think I've heard something like that. Yeah, where you aim, fire, adjust, aim, fire, adjust kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. Instead of aiming 10 times and only firing once.
I think you can learn a lot about whether what you're doing is working just by testing it. Like say you were looking for a job, instead of like perfecting your cover letter and for months before sending it out, you like try sending it out to a few places, try to get feedback on what was good about your application or what wasn't, and then adjust from there. I think a lot of people, myself included, have like a fear of doing that because there's kind of an inner perfectionist in a lot of us where it's just like, I do not want to be seen doing anything imperfectly.
And the fear of rejection as well. Could I ask, like, are there any, because you must have grown a bit of a tough skin from like launching this prototype, and I imagine there must have been some pretty rough feedback in the early stages. Can you share any about what might have happened?
No, completely. I've definitely gotten some rough feedback and definitely have to develop a thick skin. I tell people when we do user tests that like there's no such thing as bad feedback. If something's not working, it's nothing to do with them. It's all to do with the prototype. And so as a result, people just basically criticize everything. And sometimes it's like, okay, that's not at all the kind of feedback I need right now, but like, thank you. Like, it can get pretty rough, but I think the biggest, of course, you just have to swallow that. You want to really encourage people to just think out loud while they're using the prototype. And so you don't want them to filter themselves at all. So you just have to take it. And of course, the most common thing is that, you want to kind of figure out if the features that you've built are features that are actually needed. That's the key part. But you're not so much concerned about fixing all the bugs. So essentially things will crash or like, there's like a wrong number or this or that. And people will be like, oh, there's a mistake here. And that's totally fine. But I'm more interested in the development stage of like, would you actually use this? Or is that feature not really like interesting to you? And
you've not yet gotten to the spell check stage. You're still figuring out the outline.
That's a good way of putting it, actually.
That's my writer background.
It totally makes sense though. It's like, is this message the right message? I will worry about spelling later.
Exactly. That's awesome. So I've actually gone through the current mock-up of the Lighter Footprint app that you guys have on your website, which we will link below in the show notes if that's okay, so people could take a look at it. And I noticed that there's actually two different kind of measurements that you guys produce. There's the carbon footprint and then the ecological footprint. And I was just wondering if you could cover a little bit about how those two things are different and maybe why you chose to include both of them in the app.
Okay. That's a great question. So just to kind of like give you a summary at a high level of what the app does. So
Yeah.
users take like a 10-minute quiz that basically digs into their lifestyles and preferences. They're then given a result, which is like the carbon and ecological footprint, as you mentioned. They see like how their footprint compares to the average person living in their city and other kind of relevant details. And then they're also given like a whole bunch of suggestions on how they can reduce it based on both like what they said were their goals at the time. Like say, I wanted to get fit. It might suggest that I bike to work instead of taking the bus or something along those lines. And also what is the highest impact area for me. Mm-hmm. So, and then basically users will select what suggestions they'd like to take on, and they're able to track that over time, track their footprint improvements, that is. So yeah, that's what the app does. In terms of the carbon and ecological footprint, well, the carbon footprint is one that a lot of people are familiar with these days because of climate change. It basically measures the carbon and carbon equivalents, like other things that create the greenhouse effect. Mm-hmm. Often the things that are most carbon intensive, like have a higher carbon footprint, are things that burn a lot of fuel. So a plane trip burns a lot of fuel, so therefore it has a high carbon footprint. So yeah, you can think about like driving and other things like that as having high carbon footprints. Yeah, and so this number is super relevant to right now because it's basically what we need to do is lower our carbon footprint overall as a society in order to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees. Mm-hmm. And we actually need to cut our carbon footprint in half by 2030, I believe.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense target.
Yes, it is. Very pressing. Yeah. So, I think that personally, I think that focusing on carbon footprint for right now is absolutely the right thing to do. So I think, this is the most timely thing to look at. Mm-hmm. But the ecological footprint is an also really important measure. So what the ecological footprint calculates is the amount of land and ocean needed to like feed you, clothe you, create the stuff that you use, and also absorb the pollution that your lifestyle makes. And so how it's calculated is you take all the ecologically productive land and ocean in the world, which I think is like 12 billion hectares or something along those lines. Yeah, you don't count the Sahara, you don't count like places like that, but take all the land in the world and then you basically divide it up with the amount of people currently on the planet. So that makes it 1.7 hectares, I think is the current number. Of course, like as we have more and more people, that number will go down. Mm-hmm. So 1.7 hectares per person. Okay. So essentially, if you can imagine like your lifestyle, basically all the like, wood that's used to create your furniture or other things, like all the, fish that you eat and other things like that should be created within. So if you are living a one planet lifestyle, your lifestyle does not exceed. Unfortunately, that is not the case for most of us.
A lot of people would probably be using much more. And I imagine there's probably millions of people in other parts of the world that might be using less than their fair share.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to use less, but we want to use it in a way where everyone can be like happy and healthy and safe and all these things. So in Canada, I think we use 5 times that amount.
Jeez.
Yeah, good stuff. So basically, if you've ever heard of the term like one planet living, or it would take, in Canadians' case, it would take 5 planets to sustain our lifestyle. Like that's kind of where that number comes from, the ecological footprint. So basically the ecological footprint is very key to humans like long-term survival and thriving on the planet, because obviously if we use more resources, then nature can regenerate. At some point
we're in trouble.
We are going to hit a wall, and it's not going to be pretty. So that is key for that reason. Okay. I wanted to mention that the carbon footprint and the ecological footprint, which are ways of measuring impact, don't capture all things that actually impact nature in some way. So, for example, like overfishing or factory farming or things like that are not necessarily reflected. So there is like a lot of kind of environmental causes that are not really reflected in these kind of scientific ways of measuring impact. Yeah. So yeah, it's very confusing for the average person because you're like, I know ocean plastic is a huge problem, but it's not really showing up in the same way on my carbon or ecological footprint.
Yeah.
But that said, I think that these numbers or these ways of thinking about impact are the most crucial and important for right now. So I think that's fine, basically, to look at those first.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that because it does point out that we are working with what we currently have. And like these measurement tools are, at the end of the day, they're a tool, right? And like, so I think often what people get hung up on when it comes to how to adjust their own individual lifestyle, you mentioned this about like learning how to become a sustainable person, is this feeling that we need to attain some kind of sustainable perfection. But unfortunately, well, I mean, it's just a reality that we're not really living in a world that has tools or resources that allow us to even reach some kind of sustainable perfection. And this can cause this kind of weird negative feedback loop of we're not good enough or we're not doing enough or what have you. And I think it's important that everyone listening remember that, you know, do what you can do within the context of what we currently have available to us. And these tools are very useful. But who knows, maybe in 5, 10, 20 years, there'll be a new tool that tells us a bit more about what we can do then. But we can't tear ourselves apart trying to.
Yeah, totally. I think better or like perfect should not be the enemy of good. I think better is better than nothing.
Yeah,
definitely.
I fully agree. It's better to do something imperfectly than to not do it at all.
Exactly. Like I really think we need everyone trying to live slightly more sustainably in an imperfect way to get anywhere whatsoever. And what people aren't or are able to do will just depend on their circumstances. And
fully agree.
So as it happens, like according to the research of Dr. Ginny Moore, we only have influence on about, like any kind of influence on 60% of what is attributed to our footprint. So there's only like a little bit, or you can't kind of like directly tackle your whole footprint. You only have direct control over some things like the food you eat, etc. So and it also is worth mentioning that our society doesn't currently support like a totally sustainable lifestyle in terms of like how our buildings are built and how like our vehicles are run and things like that. So it's very it's really difficult at this point to live sustainably. So I think the goal is just to try to have whatever influence you can in the world. And I think one of those ways you can do that is live a healthy, happy, slightly more sustainable life. And in that way, help support the systemic changes and innovations that are absolutely needed.
And have these conversations. You know, I think that conversation is a underlooked tool when it comes to sustainable living, because I know that I've often assumed that people around me already know the stuff that I've been obsessing over for the past 10 years, where it's like I'm like tearing myself apart trying to figure out how to not have any more plastic in my life. And I mean, I've gotten over that a little bit, but there's, I'll have a conversation with someone and they're like, what do you mean? That's so interesting. Thank you for telling me, and conversation's really important. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, like none of us are perfect, and I get that. But I do think it's important to do.
I totally think so. I think like one of the best ways is to, be open and be vocal, like you mentioned. in marketing, the sort of underlying message of everyone's doing this thing, like you're going to get left behind if you don't, is like a super powerful thing that we've seen like throughout the last century, where basically marketers like introduce a new product and are like, everyone's doing this basically. Like, don't you want the latest thing, the latest whatever, the latest soap? But so I think we are such herd animals, I'm not sure, group animals. And we like the idea that there's like this newest way, this newest thing is really powerful for us in how we work and think. So I think that if more people are sort of more visible about what they're doing, and not necessarily like critical and mean about it, just like living their best life in a more sustainable way and being kind of open about it. I think that does a lot for influencing people in your immediate circle and basically normalizing and making greener behavior more attractive.
Yeah.
So
while building the Lighter Footprint app, bringing it back to that, was there anything in particular that like you want to share about what you've learned while building it? Is there some interesting things, interesting lessons from building the app?
Yeah, there's a few things. Definitely, there was kind of this realization that the things that I thought were most important environmentally are not necessarily the things with the highest carbon footprint.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was shocked to discover, for example, how much beef and lamb have such a huge impact for in a way that I didn't really understand. Basically, because of the land and energy and food needed to feed those animals to maturity, it has a hard carbon footprint. And also just the simple fact that beef produce methane.
Oh, yes.
Yes, good old cow farts. So basically, the funny reality of it being that because methane is so powerful, that's actually a serious cause.
I've learned recently in my studies that methane is almost this like 10 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I do want to do a little slight correction. I'm not sure if it was just a joke, but it's actually not cow farts, it's cow burps.
No, I had no idea. That's so funny.
Which I thought was so strange, but they tend to not fart very much, if at all. They tend to burp. And that's where the methane comes from.
Well, I shouldn't have assumed. I was just like, of course we're talking about farting here. No, that's really interesting to know. I just noticed in working with the app data and doing my own footprint that beef and lamb, basically how much you eat, those two things. And in third place, cheese, how much you eat cheese as well.
Yes.
I know, such a shame. Cheese. Like,
just makes it more important to choose a good cheese that you're really gonna enjoy if you're gonna have it. Like that's always been my thing. Agree. Yeah,
exactly. Eat it like a treat or a dessert.
Don't get why bother cheese. Get the good stuff.
Totally. If you're gonna eat it, just really enjoy it. Cool. Absolutely. Some of the other things were, I just had no idea how much like your location determines how much, what makes the biggest difference.
Like where you live, like your city or?
Your city in particular, like your energy source, your electricity grid. So that was really interesting. And like a lot of people, like a lot of test users, I thought that stuff had a way bigger like carbon and ecological footprint than it does. Stuff that we use and buy. And didn't realize as much how much what I ate and how I got around and how much I traveled had a big impact as well. Yeah, another big takeaway actually was that I think it's far more important what you buy than how you dispose or get rid of it. I think it's something like 90% of a product's impact is in the production of it and not so much in the disposal. So it doesn't really matter, relatively speaking, how you recycle or like kind of dispose of the thing after you're done with it.
Yeah.
It's more about the production. So basically that I think means that using old stuff is always better than the new, more eco-friendly thing, or as a general rule, like when it comes to clothing and things like that.
Use what you have or what you can source secondhand rather than buying something new and fancy just because it says it's sustainable.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to go buy like a new like thermos or coffee mug.
Yeah.
To stop using paper cups, you could maybe like get one secondhand or
Oh my God, there's so many of them at the thrift stores. If you're looking for if you're looking for a coffee thermos, just go to a thrift store. They might not be pretty, but like they serve their function.
Yeah, totally. Like there are a lot of thrift stores. I noticed that the other day, actually.
Yeah. So in your opinion, what can people listening do to like use these lessons that you've learned and make a difference to lighten their own footprints? Like what are maybe the top 2 or 3 tips that you want them to take away from this?
Well, I really think what we were just saying before about being open and vocal about what you're doing and what you're learning is really key. Also, like living a very happy, healthy, sustainable life in a way that can make it more appealing to other people, I think is key too. I really think that people can try to think about how they can apply their unique skill set to the problem. I didn't think that I could possibly make an impact because I don't have a science background, but in just kind of like thankfully working with a scientist, working with Dr. Jenny Moore, hopefully the Lighter Footprint app will be able to help people in some way.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Thinking about how your skills apply is such a big thing. And something that comes to mind is often people will say, oh, well, I just work at a restaurant, or I just work, at a store or something like that. And I remember that you also have the ability to have these conversations within that space too, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
If you work at a restaurant, let's have that conversation about, okay, what do our takeout containers look like?
Exactly.
Where do we get our electricity from? Where do we source our food? All that kind of stuff.
How much food waste do we make? Yeah. I really think there's like an impact to be made in every sphere.
Everyone.
Yeah. Before working on the Lighter Footprint app, a lot of my clients will occasionally print books or print like tangible physical materials. And I realized, or somebody told me, that we should be looking at ways to reduce the use of paper from trees and instead look at paper from bamboo and other things. So basically just sourcing that from the printer and just suggesting it. And a lot of people that I work with were just happy to make the switch. There's definitely not a difference in quality or anything like that. So and hopefully that has saved a lot of trees over the years.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. So we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask, what are the next steps for the Lighter Footprint app before we wrap up? Where are we going from here, and how can people maybe get involved?
Thanks. Yeah. So the Lighter Footprint app is going to be doing a soft launch in 2021 in select BC municipalities. So basically, if people live in BC, they could sign up on our website to get access when it does launch. And a bit on the topic of what we were talking about before with continual testing. Constantly looking for people to give feedback and give their thoughts and kind of be part of this like co-creating of the Lighter Footprint app. So if people are interested in that, they can sign up at lighterfootprint.org/testing, I believe. And that would also be a huge help.
Yeah. And it's free to sign up and it doesn't take much time to do, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Hopefully it'll be a tool to just understand, like with your personal footprint, what are the areas that make the biggest difference for you, and what are kind of like the changes that you can make right now that fit your lifestyle that can make a big difference over the long term.
That's awesome. Did you also want to share where people could keep up with you and your work at Etho?
You can find me at etho.studio. That's our studio URL. And that's where we post and update our current work and the stuff that we're working on in and outside of the Lighter Footprint app.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Anna. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, this was fun. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EcoThink podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning something with us today. EcoThink podcast is an official product of EcoThink Productions. You can find past episodes, transcripts, and show notes on ecothinkproductions.com/podcast. You can support us by following us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions and join the Patreon on patreon.com/EcoThink. See you next week.